There's a lot to go along with agreeing to represent somebody. A lot of legal responsibilities that go along with representing somebody, duties that we owe this person if we agree to represent somebody. When I say represent somebody, what does that mean? To represent somebody? Anybody want to chime in? What does that mean to represent somebody in a real estate transaction? Help me out, somebody.
Would it be like having the customer's like best interests at
Very
heart?
good, very good job. You took the words right out of my mouth. That's exactly what I'm usually looking for. We've agreed to look out after that person's best interest, negotiate on their behalf. When we've agreed to represent somebody. And again, that doesn't happen by accident, that representation. Virginia says in order to properly represent somebody, that has to happen by written agreement. We have to sign a contract with that person. They call this an employment agreement because the person is hiring us and our brokerage to look out after them and their best interest throughout this real estate transaction. They sign a contract. When it comes to the seller, for some reason, we don't have any problem thinking about this. This is simple. We become the seller's representative when we meet the seller, discuss selling their home. They say, yes, I want you to be my agent, you're my broker, and they hire us to represent them and sign a listing agreement. That's how the representation begins with the seller. They sign that listing agreement. Without that listing agreement, you're not the seller's agent, are you? You can't put your sign in the front yard. Well, it works the same way with a buyer. Here's the hard part that's harder to understand. It's the same way with a buyer. Unless the buyer signs a written contract with you, hiring them to represent them, you're not their agent. Without that contract, and if they haven't signed that contract with anybody else, they're what we call a customer. By definition, a customer, and you might want to write this down, a customer is an unrepresented third party. I call them unrepresented because they have yet to hire anybody by written agreement to represent them and look out after their best interest. So at this point, they're representing themselves, unrepresented. And when I say third party, you and your broker are one party. The sellers of the home that you're discussing with this buyer is the second party. That makes them the third party. They're an unrepresented third party. They're a customer. But here's one of the main points. There's two main points I'm going to give you in this chapter. Here's one of the main points you need to understand, and you might want to write this down. When the buyer is a customer, our job is to look out after the seller and represent the seller's best interest in a real estate transaction. We're the seller's representative if we're not the buyer's agent. And it doesn't matter what property you're discussing. You're a real estate agent with Rose and Womble, and you're discussing a property listed with Chantel Ray. If this buyer's a customer, an unrepresented third party, you're the listing agent's assistant, the sub-agent of the listing agent representing the seller. Our real estate system is a system of sub-agency. We have agreed going into this, we agree that if we're not representing the buyer, our job is to look out after the seller and represent the seller's best interest. This is not new. This is the way it was always been. When we start a very similar chapter in the national book covering this, we start off with what they call the history of agency, and they go back into the 50s. In the 50s, there was only one agency or one brokerage involved in a real estate transaction. That broker would list the seller's home for sale. They would market the property, and through their marketing efforts, they would locate the buyer. They would assist the buyer by writing up the contract for the buyer, but they don't represent the buyer. They don't give that buyer advice. Only the seller would be given advice. The buyer was unrepresented, a customer. I guess the thinking was it's the seller paying the commission, so it's the seller that gets representation. That was in the 50s. In the 1960s, brokers started to share listings. And it worked so well, they created that MLS system, which is just basically a database of listings that we all share and show each other's properties, the MLS system. So now in the 60s, two agents are involved. One brokerage lists the home for sale and another brokerage produces a buyer. But even with this system, everybody's job was to represent the seller. The buyer was never represented. They were always a customer. Would you believe it was not until the mid-90s, in the mid-90s, they came up with the concept of representing a buyer in a real estate transaction. The mid-90s. I know what some of you are thinking. That's when I was born. Well, for me, the mid-90s was just the other day. This happened just the other day, it seems like, the mid-90s, where we started representing a buyer in a real estate transaction. And again, the way that representation happens is the buyer hires us by a contract, written agreement to represent them and look out after their best interests. So I guess it all depends on how you're getting your business. If I got a call one day from a buyer that says, hey, you helped a buddy of mine buy a house last month. He was really happy with your services. I would like to buy a house and I want you to be my agent. Well, I'd say, let's meet at my office. We'll sit down and talk about the buying process, talk about me representing you, maybe even look at some listings on the computer. And I'm going to need you to sign a buyer representation agreement, this contract where they're hiring me. But this is somebody that knows me and they're already comfortable with me. So they don't mind signing that agreement up front. By signing that contract, they're making a commitment. They're agreeing that they're going to work with me exclusively, no other agents. And again, I asked for 6 months for buyers. I asked for that exclusive representation for 6 months. And they agree that when they buy a house, I will get paid a 3% commission. If the seller's only paying 2% commission, they have to chip in the other 1% because they agree I will get a 3% commission. So I get a lot of calls from buyers I've never met before. A buyer calls me up and says, hey, I saw your listing. Can you come show it to me? Well, if I told that buyer, before I show you my listing, you have to sign a contract with me, they'd say, forget about it. I'm going to call another real estate agent. You know, a buyer that's never met you before, they're not willing to make that kind of commitment. So it's not unusual for me. My relationship with a buyer starts as a customer relationship where we have no representation agreement. Usually for me, actually, it starts with a phone call. The buyer calls up and says, can you tell me about your listing? What's the first question I should always ask that buyer? Are you being represented? What I'm asking them is, have they signed a contract with another brokerage, hiring that broker to represent them? If they say yes, there's nothing I can do for this person. I really shouldn't even be talking to them. I'm going to tell them, go call your agent, right? If they say yes, I'm hoping they say no. I'm hoping they say no for 2 different reasons. Number one, I'm looking for my next buyer client. They're not my buyer client yet, but I'm hoping this now starts into something and we develop into that relationship. But number 2, if they say, no, I have not signed a contract with anybody, I'm not represented, red flags, alarm bells should go off. This person has just identified themselves as a customer. And Virginia says when they identify themselves as a customer, we have to make it very clear to this person up front who we actually represent. So here's number 2 point to take from this chapter. Write this down. Number 1 point was if the buyer is a customer, we always represent the seller. Number 2 point, and understand this, we always disclose who we represent to the party that's not being represented. Understand that concept in all cases. We always disclose who we represent to the party that's not being represented. When that buyer told me, no, I'm not being represented, I have to disclose who I represent. I'll be happy to tell you about my listing, but please understand I represent the seller. I'm the seller's agent. See, if I just started blabbing on at this point, before I made that disclosure, wait till you see this master bedroom. You're going to love it. It's huge. And the master bathroom, the living room, you know, all these features of the house, they're going to, you know, the way I'm positively talking to them and whatnot, building up the property, they think I'm representing them. So it's important that I make it clear up front that I'm not their agent. The next thing the buyer is probably going to say after I describe the property, they're going to say, hey, can you come show me the property? So I get in my car, I drive out to meet this buyer, get out of my car, shake their hand. Well, I used to do that, shake their hand. Here's my business card. Buyer, before I show you this property, we have to make it very clear that I'm not representing you. I'm representing the seller. Really what this results in is giving the buyer a little education on agency because they don't understand this, right? You have to understand, they have to understand, you know, we have to explain to them what that means to represent them and the fact that we're not representing them and what representation means. So, but we have to put it in writing. They have to sign a form that says, I understand you're not my agent. A buyer has to sign something with you up front when you first meet them in person before you start discussing properties anyway. They can either sign a buyer representation agreement or they can sign this simple form that we're going to see in this chapter where they say, I understand you're not my agent. They have to sign one of those 2 forms up front with us. Have to make proper disclosure. We have to put it in writing. I'd rather them sign that buyer representation agreement, but at this point, they're probably not willing to do that. So I start off this relationship with this buyer as a customer. I show them that property that they called me about, but you know what? They normally don't end up buying that property. This was just a chance to meet the buyer and start something with this buyer. If you're a smart agent, you probably bought another 3 or 4 listings with you for the neighborhood, right? My objective is to spend a couple hours with this buyer so that they can get to know me better. And we start building this relationship, showing them properties, right? But as I'm showing them the properties, I have to make it clear to the buyer that I'm not representing them. I'm representing the seller, and I can't really give them any kind of advice. What kind of advice is the buyer looking for at this point? Normally the advice the buyer's looking for is this a good price or not? Or maybe something regarding the condition of the home. Well, keep in mind, if they're a customer and I'm representing the seller, I could not give this buyer any kind of advice on that price. I have to honor the price since I'm representing the seller. Yeah, $250 looks like a pretty good price for the neighborhood. Yeah, homes are selling for $250 out here. I have to represent my seller. So a buyer needs to sign that representation agreement with us at one point. They need to hire us to get proper advice. If this buyer is my client, I can come back. I can say, well, let's go back to the office. We'll sit down on the computer, look at some comps in the area. Maybe that price is not so good after all, $250. Maybe we should come in at $240. I can give this buyer advice if they're my client because now I'm representing them. So a buyer at one point, they need to hire an agent. And I'm telling this buyer customer this as I'm showing the properties. You need proper advice and guidance through the purchase price. So at one point, either hire me or another agent, but you need proper advice and guidance. Once we're under contract, the buyer's going to do a home inspection and they're going to want advice on what repairs to ask the seller to make. Well, if I'm the seller's agent, I can't give this buyer advice. But if I'm representing the buyer, I can give them advice on what repairs to ask for. So again, a buyer needs that representation agreement. They need to hire somebody, in my opinion, throughout the purchase process to get proper advice and guidance. We need that buyer representation agreement, because all the time we spend with this buyer as a customer, we are a volunteer. We're a volunteer. You can spend a month with this buyer customer showing the properties. You've showed this buyer 45 properties, spent 25 hours with this buyer, whatever, bought him lunch 3 different times, burnt 2 tanks of gas. You call the buyer up one day and say, hey, a brand new listing hit the market. I know it's exactly what you're looking for. Let's go look at it. And they can say, no, thanks. I don't need you anymore. I bought another house from another real estate agent yesterday. This buyer's never made any kind of commitment to us. They've never hired us by this employment agreement, this buyer representation agreement. So they're free to do whatever they want. We've been a volunteer with our time. So point being is we both need that representation agreement. We need it to protect our time that we invest with this buyer. The buyer needs the representation agreement for proper guidance throughout the purchase process. But without that representation agreement, understand the buyer is a customer. And you're always representing the seller. So you have to understand what position you're in with a buyer at what point, understand that. It's very important. That's one side of the coin, you understanding what position you're in. The other side of the coin is the buyer understanding what position they're in with us, because we learn this stuff in school. They don't know any of this stuff. It's easy for them to assume. A buyer walks into your office one day and says, I'm looking for something in the 300 range, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. And you're like, I know 3 good listings down the road. Let's go. You put them in your car and you proceed to show them these properties. They automatically think you're representing them. But who are you representing? You're representing the seller, because they've never signed any representation agreement. Isn't that an odd situation to put somebody in, putting them in a position where they think you're representing them, but you're actually representing the seller? So Virginia says back in 2012, they say, oh, no, from now on, we have to clear this up. From now on, since 2012, a buyer, when it's over the phone, we have to do it verbally, make that disclosure up front. But if we meet a buyer in person, they have to sign some type of representation agreement with us, either hiring us to be their agent or agreeing that we're not representing them. Has anybody bought a house in here since 2012? Marguerite, when you first met your agent, did they ask you to sign something?
So I actually had 2 agents. I had one agent who forcefully brought the agreement up to me, which I thought was weird because I had bought houses in Maine and I didn't understand it and it caught me off guard and it didn't come off right.
Mhm.
And then the second one, she had me sign because I had told her about my first experience. She had me sign the first one, but she said, like, after probably looking at 5 houses, she explained the difference to me.
Mhm.
And then I was like, and then I was okay signing the contract where, the first option. But yeah, I had a pretty.
When I'm like everybody else, when they first came up with this rules in 2012, I thought, oh no, this is going to hurt my business. I'm going to have a buyer ask them to sign something up front with me before I can show them a house. But I've found now by sitting down with buyers and explaining representation, explaining agency, and then explaining things to them, they really appreciate that. Other agents don't take the time to explain them. I guess we have this natural fear of asking somebody to sign something. So
I
out of
think
that fear, a lot of people they do it wrong. They don't get that signature, but doing that signature is a big, big mistake, not doing that signature.
It's definitely the communication and how you come across and having proper communication. And I think that it's very positive once you understand it, but coming at somebody, like sideways. And then
Yeah.
the technique that real estate agent had, she didn't want to find a house that I wanted. She wanted me to buy one of the first 5 houses that she showed me.
Like the TV show, I always get a kick out. I'm going to show you 3 houses. You have to pick one of them.
Yeah, and I was like, no.
It doesn't work like that. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
But I've even had buyers ask me or say to me, well, how do I get you to become my agent? Once I sit down and explain all this stuff to them, they appreciate that, So I guess, my tactic is always the soft sell. I'm not a hard pressure person. I work with that buyer as a customer until they're ready to sign. Well, I can't say that. I want them to sign that buyer representation agreement at one point because, I've got to measure how much time I'm willing to invest with this buyer without a commitment. But usually that's not a problem. If they're serious buyers and they understand the concepts and understand representation, then they're usually willing to sign that agreement. But I don't make them do it right off the bat. I let them get to know me first. Yeah, I think they should know me, if they're going to make that kind of commitment to me. So usually works out. So anyway, that's a little review of agency. What are our main points? If the buyer is unrepresented, whatever property we're discussing with that buyer, we represent the seller. We have to be aware of that when we talk to that buyer and what we say to that buyer. Giving that buyer any advice could lead them to believe that we're representing them. And that's what they call implied agency. And that's very illegal in Virginia, leading a buyer to believe that you're representing them when they're not. And number 2 was that in order to protect the consumer, we always have to disclose who we represent to the party that's not being represented. Proper disclosures up front. Remember those old karate movies? Before I beat you up, I have to let you know my hands are registered as lethal weapons. We're the trained professionals. They're not. We go through this class and study to learn this stuff. They don't know any of this stuff. So we have to let them know that we're going to use our training and our skills on whose behalf. That's why we always disclose who we represent to the party that's not being represented. I'll be happy to tell you about my listing, but please understand, I'm speaking on the seller's behalf.